All right. Good evening to everyone. We welcome you to Thursday evening on the virtual Migrant Trail Walk for 2021. Tonight we have three panelists who are going to continue our discussion about the conditions along the border, particularly how the Border Patrol is perpetuating its culture of cruelty and causing a lot of the suffering that's going on there. And we will be talking about how to bring accountability to the Border Patrol's work and to make it so that it is a more humane and reasonable place for people to live in, to come through, and to work in. So I'm going to pass this to Jamie Wilson for a moment. We have some announcements, and then I will introduce the panelists and we'll go.
Hi friends, welcome to day 5. I think it's day 5. Who's to know? I think we'd be at Caballo Loco. If I'm not mistaken, we would have had a shower. We'd all be happy. Ernie's of course in the room. Couldn't get him out tonight. So par for the course. We have one quick announcement about Saturday's sessions. Saturday we have I don't know if you caught that. He said President Trump is evil. I don't know where he picked that up. Ernie. Okay. Saturday we have designed the walk, the virtual walk, to include time for breakout sessions and for each team or people to come together on their teams to have some time to speak with one another and talk about taking action in our communities or wherever you want to, but kind of putting forth a path to actions, because it's one of those things that on the walk that we often talk about and it comes back, and we tend to always wish we spent more time maybe figuring out what we can do to, completely undo the militarization of these borderlands. So you have received an email today and in your email tomorrow. We're asking you, if you want to participate on Saturday in these discussions, that you register for them. So that's coming in an email. That's in today's email, if I'm not mistaken, and will also be in tomorrow. So please look for that. And I think that's all I have. Okay. Thank you.
So, by the way, that is Jamie Wilson, longtime caminante and member of the organizing committee of the Migrant Trail Walk. I am Tom Cowell. Likewise, this is my 18th year as a caminante and as a member of the organizing committee. So we have three panelists tonight to talk about accountability, moving from a culture of cruelty to accountability for the Border Patrol and things around that. So our first panelist tonight is Katie Merdzda. She is with the American Immigration Council. She is the advocacy manager for Immigration Justice Campaign at the council, and she focuses on legal advocacy and policy related to immigration detention across the country. She previously advocated for asylum-seeking mothers and children on issues including medical care, pregnancy, family separation, and access to counsel at Proyecto Dili. She earned a master's degree in international policy and development from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. She assisted migrants on the US-Mexico border with no more deaths and served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Panama before that. She will be speaking on the history of racism in the Border Patrol and on the family detention conditions that are existent today. Our second panelist is Jen Budd. Jen is, excuse me, she's the former senior patrol agent and senior intelligence agent for the U.S. Border Patrol. She's a former Border Patrol agent turned immigrant rights activist. She's an advocate against militarization and for immigrant rights and an ambassador for the Southern Border Communities Coalition. Jen was one of the first agents to be hired as part of the Operation Gatekeeper in 1994, marking the beginning of the era of militarized deterrence that persists today. As an agent, she witnessed firsthand the cruelty, racism, and violence that we now know to be the cultural pillars of the U.S. Border Patrol. She's written, "I refuse to ignore the corruption I witnessed on a daily basis or pretend that the wall wasn't pushing people out to dangerous terrain and leading to their deaths. I decline to do as ordered. I decline to look the other way as agents smuggled in drugs and assaulted migrants, so I left. I used to detain immigrants at the border, now I help them." Since leaving the Border Patrol, Jen has dedicated herself to speaking out against their culture of corruption and impunity. Through her activism, Jen is atoning for the abuses her former agency has committed and is asking that all current Border Patrol agents lay down their guns and badges and join her. She will be speaking about an insider perspective, what her path was from an agent to a whistleblower, what can be done at the agent level. Can we be asking agents to stand down? What actions can lead to accountability for the past and future? What does Jen want to get on the table? Our third panelist is Todd Miller. Todd is a long-time commandante. He was on the first migrant Border Patrol, He was on the first migrant trail walk. And you've been around on the migrant trail longer than me, Todd. You're one of the few. So, because I missed the first one. So he's a co-founder and a journal of the Migrant Trail. He's an author and journalist. He's been reporting from international border zones for over 25 years. This is one of my favorite books. That's his first, Border Patrol Nation. In his new book, Build Bridges, Not Walls, he invites readers to join him on a journey that begins with the most basic of questions. What happens to our collective humanity when the impulse to help one another is criminalized? Todd is a contributing editor on border and immigration issues for NACLA Report on the Americas and its column, Border Wars. He's a founding member of the Migrant Trail. He will be speaking about the externalization of the US border to the rest of the world, building bridges, not walls, cross-border solidarity, accountability for the prevention through the deterrence system. How over the 18 years since Todd has been involved with the Migrant Trail walk, the border has been militarized astronomically during that time. How do we abandon this travesty of a system and demilitarize the border? Katie, you want to start us off?
Yes, thanks so much, Tom. It's an honor to be on this panel and to participate in the Migrant Trail this week. I've especially appreciated listening to the presentations from people who are directly affected by the border and the Border Patrol, as I'll be speaking about a report today that's mostly from secondary sources and from hearing stories from migrants that I've worked with. The report that I wrote with a colleague at the American Immigration Council is called The Legacy of Racism Within the US Border Patrol. And we wrote it to show that the incidents of brutality and racism that we hear that come from the Border Patrol are not something new. It's not something that can be easily reformed. It's something that is baked into the very character, the foundations of this agency. And in fact, even the policy that existed even before the agency was founded, in the late 1800s, there was a series of anti-Asian immigration laws, including the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, that in many ways were excluding railroad workers who had previously been recruited and were no longer needed. And we see that same racism and xenophobia throughout the history of immigration law and policy. We just see shifts in nationalities and races that are prioritized for enforcement. Today, it's still directed at Mexicans, but also immigrants from Central and South America, from the Caribbean, from Central Africa, and other places around the world. And again, even before the Border Patrol was formed, there was the Immigration Act of, in the same year that it was formed, of 1924, creating the National Origins Quota System, which prioritized immigration from Northern and Western Europeans over the rest of the world. And there wasn't quotas for the Western Hemisphere, including Mexico, but at that time, previously, people could pass freely over the US-Mexico border, and there started to be increasing restrictions such as visa fees, health examinations, literacy tests, a requirement to pass through a port of entry that were making it more difficult. And so that's the context for the Border Patrol's creation in 1924. As Lupe talked about on Sunday, many of the agents were recruited from racist organizations like the KKK, the Texas Rangers, which were known for extrajudicial killings of Black people, people of Mexican descent. And because of that, they brought from these organizations a culture of brotherhood, of silence, protecting each other, and even revenge by proxy, which meant that if a Border Patrol agent was killed by someone believed to be of Mexican descent, agents would find someone else completely not connected to the first person who appeared to be of Mexican descent and kill them in revenge. And so it's with that culture that the small agency started, but the budget soon skyrocketed quickly, and just a couple years in the early days of Border Patrol, the staff was doubled with hiring requirements lowered, which is still a problem we see to this day. And even the very beginnings of an enforcement strategy of making it difficult to cross in populated areas, forcing people out into more dangerous areas that we know as prevention through deterrence now. Even back in the 1940s, one person per day was dying crossing the border, and including many children. And so at first, the Border Patrol was targeting Asian immigrants and Southern and Eastern Europeans who at the time were considered racially undesirable as well. But there's soon a shift towards Mexican citizens based on physical appearance, leading to the surveillance of anyone who appeared to be of Mexican descent living in the border region, regardless of their immigration status, and including people whose family had owned that same land since it was part of Mexico, which was particularly offensive. And in 1943, the Border Patrol deployed what was called special Mexican deportation parties, so very clearly targeting Mexicans, even though there were many other nationalities of undocumented immigrants. But at the same time, still continuing to perpetuate harm against other racial groups in other ways. Border Patrol agents participated in transportation to internment camps, and some were guards for internment camps for Japanese Americans. After World War II, there's further development of this strategy of enforcement in high traffic areas, starting with the blatantly racist named Operation Wetback. And that included a raid of 5,000 5,000 immigrants were apprehended in just one morning in the Rio Grande Valley. Border Patrol also collaborated with Mexican officials to arrange bus, air, and boat lifts to return people to Mexico in absolutely inhumane conditions. One congressional committee called them a penal hell ship, and the El Paso Herald accused them of, quote, trading in human misery. And so we see this brutality from the beginning of the agency. In 1965, the quota system was reworked into close to what we have today. The Western Hemisphere was given a quota for the first time, so only 120,000 people per year from the whole Western Hemisphere could come to the US, which was actually a 40% reduction from the existing migration flows. And Mexican immigration was further cut about a decade later when they made uniform quotas for each country. But this policy ignored the geographic proximity and the economic interdependence of the two countries. Far more people than that needed to cross to fill labor needs. And so were forced out of the legal immigration system. You also continue to see racial profiling in stops that was legitimized by the Supreme Court, which ruled that while Border Patrol couldn't stop someone just for apparent Mexican ancestry, it could be one reason that they took into account. And in a similar case around the same time, Justice William Brennan dissented, saying that every American citizen of Mexican ancestry and every Mexican lawfully in this country must know after today's decision that he travels the fixed checkpoint highways at risk. And that's something that people living in the borderlands continue to see to this day. The Border Patrol's racism became even more dangerous in the 1980s with heavy militarization that was rationalized by saying that the Border Patrol's purpose was for drug enforcement. We start to see electronic sensors, infrared radar, military weapons and helicopters, and the formation of the SWAT-style Border Patrol Tactical Unit, also known as BORTAC, as well as smaller emergency response teams that were similar in each Border Patrol sector. And so there's also an increased collaboration in general with law enforcement and the military. 400 agents participated in the crackdown on the 1992 riots in Los Angeles that were in response to the brutal anti-Black police beating of Rodney King. And in the 1900s, just a further concentration of in the 1990s, sorry, the further concentration of agents in high traffic areas with operations in different places along the border: Hold the Line, Gatekeeper, Safeguard. And the Border Patrol budget, again, skyrocketing from the early 90s to today. And in 1994 is when the Border Patrol officially implements what it begins to call prevention through deterrence, although, as I've mentioned, that's something that was developed throughout the whole history of the Border Patrol. And that's why, over the last 2 decades, there's been about the remains of 8,000 people found in the border region, even though the death toll is likely much higher as people were forced to migrate out through these more dangerous areas. And then after the September 11th terrorist attacks, that adds pressure for a change from dismantling what was previously called the Immigration and Nationality Service, and putting those agencies within the new Department of Homeland Security, including the Border Patrol, which became part of an umbrella agency, Customs and Border Protection. So Border Patrol are the agents that are patrolling between ports of entries at checkpoints, but Customs agents, the Office of Field Operations agents that you see at port of entries are also within that larger Customs and Border Protection. There's continued militarization. The CBP budget nearly tripled since the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. And we continue to see what we've seen throughout history, the anti-Asian, anti-Latino, and as we discussed on Monday, anti-Indigenous racism, with the destruction of ecological lands, the destruction of sacred sites. If you watched the video earlier this week, the arrest of Nellie Jo David and others for protesting the destruction of Quito Baquito, the sacred spring last September. And so we also see anti-Black racism from the Border Patrol. It's been increasing in relevance in recent years as more Black migrants come to the border. For example, in 1 week in 2019, the Del Rio Border Patrol sector encountered more than 500 African migrants, which was more than double the total across all of the border for the previous year. So this is something that's becoming more and more important to address, the Border Patrol's treatment of Black migrants. The Border Patrol agents continue to have connections to white supremacist groups, as they have from the beginning of their history. We saw BORTAC deployed to the streets of Portland, Oregon for Black Lives Matter protests in July 2020, and deployed to even George Floyd's funeral and authorized to use deadly force there. There's also been over 100 people killed by the Border Patrol. One that I think about the most is Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez. As many of you know, the 16-year-old who was shot 10 times in the back in 2012. I think of him frequently because I was sleeping 3 blocks away when I lived in Nogales that night. And for those of you who have been there, it's just completely ridiculous to think that he could have been a threat to a Border Patrol agent at the top of a cliff and then on the other side of a wall when he was shot in the back. And yet, despite this violence, there's still been these huge increases in agents from about 12,000 to 20,000 between, for example, 2006 and 2009 in just 3 years. And with that, a lowering of hiring standards in order to meet these goals. The Office of the Inspector General for the Department of Homeland Security has said that the Department of Homeland Security does not have sufficient policies and procedures to address employee misconduct, and yet the pattern continues. And it's not just these incidents of clear, direct physical abuse or murder that are violence and racism. There's also the more systemic kinds of violence. I've spent 2 years with mothers and their children detained in Dilley in the Family Detention Center, about an hour south of San Antonio. And they would just tell horrifying stories of the time that they spent in Border Patrol custody before being transferred to this ICE detention center. We filed a complaint after surveying mothers there. 67% of them said their child was not seen by a medical provider in Border Patrol custody. 58% said that if they asked, those 58% of those who asked for medical care for their child did not receive it. An example, one mother reported that her daughter's doctor had said she needed to bathe daily due to high risk of infection with her kidney condition. She was not allowed to change her clothes or shower for 5 days and did get an infection from that. And as we discussed earlier this week, many children have died, including 2 in December 2018. And both of those children were Indigenous. Border Patrol fails repeatedly to comply with legal requirements for language access, making it even more difficult for those children to receive medical care. And the Department of Homeland Security has not cooperated with the House Committee on Homeland Security's investigations of these deaths. So the inhumane conditions, the lack of medical care, the family separation that you all know about are all also types of violence and racism. And so just from understanding this history, we know just how deeply entrenched the culture of racism and abuse is in the Border Patrol. It's not something that can be easily repaired. The very culture equates someone being non-white as a threat. And so this is just shows the importance of shifting away from having people in Border Patrol custody and subjected to this violence and racism. With that, I'll pass it on to the other speakers.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you for that. I neglected to make one announcement before Jen starts. There's 15 minutes from each of the panelists, more or less, and then we will enter a Q&A session where people can post questions. Jamie will curate those and combine them and direct them to the panel through me. And we'll have a free-ranging discussion with all three panelists. And then after that, at around 7:30, we'll open it up. Everyone who is participating tonight will be promoted to be a panelist, and so we can have a wider discussion at that time. So with that, I'll pass it to Jen Budd.
Thank you. I guess I should explain why I joined such a racist organization, since Katie introduced the all she said was true is true about the Border Patrol. So I joined the Border Patrol in June of 1995. I graduated college from Auburn University in December of 1993 and went back and forth about law school or if I wanted to work, and I decided that I wanted to work. And somebody told me that the Border Patrol is hiring. And I'm from Alabama. I'd never heard the Border Patrol, didn't even know what it was. And you know, much like we're learning about how history's been rewritten, American history, in regards to the Black American experience, you know, the Southwestern Mexican American experience certainly is not discussed, or was not discussed, at least in my school as a child or even in college. And so when I joined the agency, I thought I was just joining another, you know, like FBI or something. It was a federal agency. It was a foot in the door. It was, and for me personally, as a gay woman, to be able to move out to San Diego to work was appealing, frankly, from being in Alabama, although I still love Alabama. But all the things that Katie talked about, they do not talk about in the Border Patrol Academy. They told us that, you know, we're after drug smugglers, and we're after, they did say human smugglers, but mostly drug smugglers and other criminals and so forth. And they made it sound kind of like the migrants are incidental. And, you know, that they just have to do it the right way, and there are plenty of ways for them to get across, was the explanation that I had. And in the academy at the time, it was my Mexican American instructor, Spanish instructor, who taught me the racist term that Border Patrol agents use for migrants. And as a young 24-year-old white woman from Alabama, I was raised in a liberal family, so I was very aware of like the civil rights movement in the South and so forth. And so I was bothered by using racist terms for migrants. And I asked him about that. And he said, you know, it's racist if you use it against an American of Hispanic descent, but it's not racist if you use it against a migrant. And, you know, half of the Border Patrol, over half of the Border Patrol now is Latino. And I remember saying, well, how do I tell who's a migrant and who's not? Because I had no idea. And they just told me that I would know. And that's all they said. And for me personally, as I started to discover what the Border Patrol was, you know, if some of you know my story, I was raped in the academy by a fellow classmate, and they covered it up. and he retired as a Border Patrol agent in management and stuff, and they covered it all those years, and that's fairly common with female agents in the Border Patrol. And as I continued on, the reason why I stayed was my home life was dysfunctional and I needed a job. So the women that you see that tend to stay in the Border Patrol, that even suffer at the hands of Border Patrol agents, are kind of like, you know, they have to. They either have children. My classmate who made it through, she had children. She needed the job more than anything. And to be honest, um, it's pretty easy as a white person. I'm not sure how people of Hispanic descent do it. You know, they have their reasons for doing it. But when the language barrier's there, and when you buy the propaganda that they put out and the justifications they put out for the harm that they do to migrants, and you fail to see the bigger picture and what your actions are doing. And this is what systemic racism is all about, is it makes it easy for white people to just say, well, it's the law, you know, and but as time went on with the things I saw and with my education in law and in policing organizations, um, I only made it about 6 years until I decided that I couldn't do it anymore. And the main reason why I left it wasn't because I had this awakening of the racism of the Border Patrol. The reason why I left was because I was a senior agent at the sector intelligence and had known for years and discovered that my boss was at my old station in Campo was the one smuggling drugs into the country. And so I decided to investigate him. And then he threatened me. I whistle blew, and they offered me a promotion, which is what they always do in the Border Patrol. They offer you a promotion to shut up. And I refused to take it. They put me down on the border that night in uniform and had somebody shoot at me intentionally, and I escaped, and I ended up just leaving. That's the short of it. And I'm being short about it because I don't want to talk too much necessarily about my experience. My experience is fairly well known. But in this with this group of speakers, I want to talk about accountability, because it seems like, because it is like, and it is happening, that Border Patrol agents never pay any price for the brutality that they dish out towards migrants, whether we're talking about Jose Antonio, like Katie was talking about, and whether we're talking about like Anastasio Hernandez Rojas, and the one like 3 years ago that they claim they're still investigating, Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez. So there's a reason why that happens. And there's a reason why Border Patrol gets away with this. And I worked with Anastasio's family, and the reason why we chose that case is it was the most well documented. And I went through the entire case for the family looking at it. So in essence, what the Border Patrol has in every sector is they have a special investigative team. In some sectors, and in San Diego sector, when Anastasio was murdered in 2010 by several agents, where he was beaten and tased to death, and it was videoed and everything, and it was atrocious. It was called the Critical Incident Investigative Team, or CIIT. And in layman's terms, they would call it a SET team. But in other sectors, they have different names for it. And they've since changed the name here in San Diego sector, but they still have these investigative teams in every sector that work every shift. So I just call them Border Patrol Special Investigative Teams. So these investigative teams are the first ones to respond. And if we look at the Anastasio Hernandez Rojas case, what happened with that is this investigative team of Border Patrol agents was called in after an hour and a half. They were the first team called in, but Border Patrol doesn't have the authority to investigate beatings. They don't have the authority to investigate murders. They don't have the authority to investigate themselves. And they don't have the legal authority. And And yeah, they're sharing some documents that I want you to see of the work that I did on the briefing that's before the Inter-American Human Rights Coalition. And so they arrived, they had at least 13 hours with the evidence and with the witnesses and with the agents who did the beating before, get this, not that the Border Patrol called the San Diego PD to investigate, but before somebody from the press called the PD and said, hey, what's going on at the border? So the way the PD found out about it was that the press was questioning what happened. So they were still trying to hide that this had happened. And just in general, and I recommend you read the casework on it. In general, what happens is these agents took the evidence, like taser plugs, and they shoot away witnesses. The many witnesses who were at the port of entry. They gathered the original video cam footage from the port of entry and made sure that the video cam footage that they gave to the San Diego PD for their investigation was taken an hour before the beating happened. So there was no beating on the videotape. And when the San Diego investigators called them on it and said, hey, give us the right tape. This is this is an hour before he even showed up at the port. They hemmed and hawed and went back and forth. And the detectives and the PD, thank God for them, they documented how they refused to answer their emails and their phone calls until at least like 3 weeks to a month later and said, oh my goodness, Border Patrol cameras and CBP cameras, they record over themselves every 10 to 14 days. Oops. Well, that's standard practice. That's what they do in the Border Patrol always. And they did that on purpose. These Border Patrol agents and the special investigative group sat in on interviews of witnesses. They sat in on the interview of Anastasio's brother. They sat in on meetings with the San Diego Homicide Department. So they knew what the investigators who were investigating their agents for murder, what evidence they had. And then the chief of the Border Patrol in San Diego Sector's chief was then Rodney Scott, who is the current chief of the entire Border Patrol. So you get promoted when you do these things. He illegally signed an immigration administrative subpoena, and he used that subpoena to get Anastasio's medical records. And when the San Diego PD went to gather the medical records from the medical examiner, they said, oh, the Border Patrol has it. And so they asked the Border Patrol for it. And Rodney Scott refused to turn over the medical records to the investigators of the murder of Anastasio, claiming that it would violate HIPAA, which is just absurd. So it's just absurd that he's gotten away with this. In the meantime, the process that they've created is these investigators, they know the entire case backwards and forwards before, whether we're talking about a local department, whether we're talking about the FBI, OIG, or OPR even investigates. So they know, they report to Rodney Scott, and then Rodney Scott turns around and reports to the chiefs in Washington, D.C. And the great thing about the Anastasio case is that we have James Tomczyk and James Wong, the former CBP commissioners and deputy commissioners of CBP Internal Affairs that Obama tried to bring in to clean up Border Patrol. And we have higher ups from OIG who came forward and said, this is what really happened. We knew what was going on. Border Patrol maintained that he wasn't handcuffed, that he was standing up, that he was fighting, and agents had to protect themselves. That's the story we're going to go with. That's what we're going to say. You're going to lie about it. And so what this does is it gets them their game plan. So every time a migrant or even an American citizen is killed at the hands of a Border Patrol agent, these agents go in and they evaluate the situation. Is it something they should fight? Is it something they should go, oh, that's just a bad agent and he doesn't represent the fine men and women we know of the Border Patrol? So it protects the agents at the same time. They're obstructing justice, they're breaking the law, and then it also creates a game plan for the press afterwards. And this is how they constantly get away with stuff. Additionally, one more thing I'd like to add, and I could talk about this endlessly, but just to give you a general idea, they're trying to control the narrative, but they also, Border Patrol pushes agents to resign the Border Patrol and join OPR and OIG. The majority of these cases, they won't ever tell you who the investigators are in OIG and OPR. But when you do find out, you find out they're usually ex-Border Patrol agents. And like Katie was saying, the United States Border Patrol is this white supremacist brotherhood. It is that, and it's what agents talk about when they say they bleed green. Once a Border Patrol agent, always a Border Patrol agent, unless you're like me. And there's a few like me, but not that many. So these units still operate. And they were out in Calexico with that supposed accident of 13 that the Border Patrol claims they weren't chasing that died in the wreck. They showed up, they were the very first ones to respond when they shot David Villalobos down here at the San Ysidro Port of Entry last October. And these units are illegal. The other thing, just one thing to add real quick, and then I'll hand it over to Todd. The other thing that they do is they claim that these investigators are solely being used to see if agents are violating policy, and it's just internally used. But what we found out in the Anastasio case is actually everything they gather and everything that they create in their reports is sent to the union lawyers who are kept on retainer. And we have one of the union lawyers saying to a judge in written document, yes, I'm ready for trial, Your Honor. I have the San Diego PD's report and I have the SET team's report, the investigative team's report from the Border Patrol. So that means they are using Border Patrol investigators who do not have the legal authority to investigate, to spy on investigations, acting like they're the part of the police brotherhood and want to get down to the bottom of it, to create a defense for their agents and for the agency when agents go like this and kill people or rape or whatever they do. And they do this even for agents nowadays who are off duty when they commit their crimes. This is something that I want to spread. This is something that I want to get out. This is something that I witnessed as an agent. And so I thank you for this opportunity to talk a little bit about it. And I'm always available to talk more about it. And I appreciate your time and thank you for the invite.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you for that testimony. Todd.
Hopefully I don't talk with a mute button push like I always do. Yeah, great. Thank you. First, I just want to thank Jen for your testimony, and I'm very inspired by your story and your courage. So I really appreciate that, and Katie as well for your thorough research on the history of what we have now with the Border Patrol. I really appreciate this, and it's really nice to be on this panel with you. And thank you, Tom, and the rest of the Migrant Trail Walk Organizing Committee. For me, it's always an honor. It's a way I can walk. This year I haven't been able to walk. Of course, we're not doing it, but I haven't been able to walk since some children came into my life. So this is a good way to be able to do it. It's really so it's really special to me to be able to do this. Like Jamie, I think mentioned, I think today was Thursday. So I always think about what day it is for the trail walk. And Thursday I believe is the day you wake up at 3 a.m, which means that it's still dark out and nobody wants to get up. and then I believe it's if I remember correctly, it's the longest day. So it takes 16 miles. And
almost 16 miles, yeah.
Yeah, right. And then you arrive at Caballo Loco. And so that's one of the longer days of the trail walk. And so it's good to be talking on this particular day. Always for me, for those who've done the walk, the day after today, which is the Friday, is a little, it's like 12 miles, but it for some reason that day is the hardest one for me. It's like maybe you psych yourself up for the 16 miles and then the 12 miles, like, what, when is this going to end? But anyhow, so like thinking in terms of the trail walk and thinking in terms of like why we do the trail walk, why we're walking to honor the people who have died, to mourn the people who have died crossing the border, often carrying a cross with a name or a desconocido or desconocida, as you know, if there was the name was unknown, to also honor the people that were crossing the desert right in that moment. And also, I mean, you know, when we started this in 2004, the idea was to look at the policy of the strategy of prevention through deterrence and effectively bring attention to it and change it. And so it's amazing. It truly is amazing to me that we're here. What is it? 18 years? 19? Is this the 18th year or the 19th year? Anyhow, I think 18 years later.
2004 was the first one, right?
Yeah, 2004. Yeah. So yeah, 18 years. And I think, and this I believe probably somebody's already mentioned, probably Kat has mentioned this. 18 years later, we're talking about the same thing. And that, you know, 18 years later, people continue to die crossing the border. And as we sit here today on this 100-degree day in Tucson in southern Arizona, we know right now that otherwise healthy people will be dying this summer again. It's you can look at it as premeditated murder in a way, because we know year after year after year this happens. It's like there's a killer on the loose, and if that killer was on the loose, then wouldn't it make sense that the killer would be stopped by somebody? But this is a killer that just continues year after year. We know it's predictable, and so it would be in thinking about accountability. You know, one of the things that I immediately think of, and is this idea of this strategy there needs to be accountability, and I mean it in the sense that the repetition of this happening year after year, but also how it is not mentioned. I remember in the 2016 presidential campaign, I did a Google search, prevention through deterrence, in quotes, deaths in the desert, you know, by you know, any of the candidates or any of the media, and nothing comes up. Like this idea that this strategy exists, we know it here, we talk about it here, but in a bigger mainstream sort of sense, it seems to be still something that isn't really known or at least talked about. And so it seems to me that there should be an accountability, like this idea of prevention through deterrence should be brought into the spotlight of accountability, and actually be at a sort of forefront of a sort of movement of you know, around looking at the border and what should be done. And so like looking in terms of accountability in that sense, I did want to look at that, prevention through deterrence, but I also wanted to look with two other things that are associated with prevention through deterrence. And Katie actually mentioned a lot about one of them, so I won't go too much into it. And that's looking at the money, looking at the kind of expansion, the buildup of the money and the budgets, and but also looking at in terms of an industrial complex that's been growing with these increasing budgets. And the other is looking at the kind of geographic expansion of it, not only on the U.S. border, but as it traverses the world. And when you look at the money, and again, Katie just mentioned this enough that I don't have to go into too much detail, but if you just take when the Migrant Trail Walk started in 2004, or just the year before, when the implementation of the Department of Homeland Security to the present, the accumulated budgets of CBP and ICE come to $350 billion. Those sorts of numbers, and in increasing fashion, right? If you look at 2003, I believe the budget was about $6 billion. And if you look at 2025 this year, or 2021, I should say, this year, the budget was $25 billion. It is $25 billion. The budget when Donald Trump took office in 2020 was $20 billion. The budget in 1994, when the prevention through deterrence operations started, of course, there's a history before then too. The budget was 1.5 billion. So you can see like the incremental increases, how they increase every year. And one of the things that I want to point out, and I think really, really deserves more attention, and as we think about accountability, is the increased participation of private companies and private industry. So if you look at, that 350 billion since the trail walk started, there was the 2006 hiring surge of the Border Patrol, where 6,000 new agents were brought in. There was the 2006 Secure Fence Act, which constructed nearly 650 miles of walls and barriers. There's this 2006 SDI net, which is a technology program. This was called Virtual Wall, which brought in all kinds of technologies, which those sorts of things have continued, and with different names in some cases, up to the present. And if you look from 2008 to 2020, there have been, between Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, so included in that also, I should mention, is private prisons. There's over 200 detention centers across the United States. The kind of deportation apparatus that comes along with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So, but if you look at 2008 to 2020, there were 105,000 contracts given out to private companies. That 105,000 contracts worth $52 billion. And so to give you a context of the sort of expansion, 52 billion, or 55, I should say $55 billion was the total of these contracts. If you take the accumulated budgets, mainly the INS from 1975 to 2003, that comes to $52 billion. So there's been more contracts given out to private industry in the last 12 years than there was in the total combined border and immigration budgets for 28 years before DHS. And this, so there's the contracts, and these contracts, like with private detention centers, but also surveillance towers, surveillance cameras, implanted motion sensors, unmanned aerial systems like drones, the remote video surveillance systems, the mobile video surveillance systems. There's all kinds of contracts given out for a number of things. The contracts go to big companies like Lockheed Martin, like General Dynamics, like General Atomics, like Northrop Grumman. Northrop Grumman just got a contract for the biometric system, the new biometric system that's being designed at this moment, and smaller companies. But the thing is, all these companies have budgets that are put towards going into key congressional members' offices during appropriations or when the budgets are being determined. They have money that they can give campaign contributions to key politicians, that sort of thing. And so the sort of influence is the interest and the influence that these companies have in propelling a continual expansion that we've seen of this border and immigration enforcement apparatus is there. And so I really think that that's an aspect that needs to have a lot of light shined upon it as well. Oftentimes when comprehensive immigration reform bills come to light, that aspect of it is just not even mentioned, or the kind of private industry aspect of it isn't mentioned as an actor. And it seems like for thinking of accountability, that should be an important focus. Accountability and influence, it should be something that is spotlighted. And the third thing I wanted to mention is the expansion, and this goes along with, you're looking at that kind of expansion with the budget expansion on the U.S.-Mexico border, but also the U.S.-Canada border, which we don't have time to go into right now, but we could, or the Caribbean border as well, what they call the third border, where there's been plenty of enforcement put in on the west coast of Puerto Rico, and there's been a lot of enforcement put on the Canadian border too. But also a big part of the expansion has been an international effort, especially in the post 9/11 era. And one story that illustrates this, I think, is the caravan of people from Honduras who crossed the border between Guatemala and Honduras in January. There was about 7,500 people in the caravan. And people might remember the caravan did not make it that far. They made it as far as Vado Hondo, which is a town very close to the border in Guatemala, where Guatemalan forces, military and police, had blockaded the road. Those forces were actually trained by the United States. There's as a part of what the U.S. government calls the expansion of the security zone, the externalization of the border, the extension of the border, which has become a pillar of the strategy. And so what resulted, and I should say, in the caravan of 7,500 people, many of those people in testimonies were displaced due to the back-to-back Category 4 hurricanes that hit the coast of Nicaragua and Honduras in November. Hurricanes that one woman talked about her town being flooded, and her 3 children living underneath a bridge from November until January, when they decided to go across. So when you look at, there's an aspect of, warming Caribbean waters and intensifying hurricanes, and that sort of effect that it has on displacement of people. And what ultimately happened was that there was a blockade, and about the forces launched tear gas into the caravan, and basically 2/3 of the people were then deported back into Honduras. And I mentioned this because when you look at, again, the 3 things that I think really need accountability is when you look at the bigger system, the prevention through deterrence system, the expansion in terms of budgets, and then of course the geographic expansion now that's going, not only is expanding in the 100-mile zones on the US-Mexico border and even on the US-Canadian border, but also this expansion that's really in a lot of ways exporting the prevention through deterrence system to other places, and where US Border Patrol agents are going to do trainings, particularly from BORTAC, which is the tactical unit that Katie mentioned that was also in Portland during the protest last year, and doing trainings and sending resources and spending money on these efforts. So I just wanted to bring up those three elements to look at as a part of a bigger system that really I think needs to have an emphasis of accountability put upon them on top of all the other things that we've mentioned. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Todd. So we're going to open the Q&A queue at this point, and ask if folks want to ask some questions or make some comments.
Tom, can I explain that real quick for folks?
Yes.
Okay, so if you have a question, there should be a Q&A icon either at the bottom of your screen or at the top of your screen, depending on the device you're on. It looks like 2 little chat boxes or quote boxes like you'd see in a cartoon. Feel free to click on that, and then you can enter your question and it will be added to the queue.
All All right.
If you're on a mobile device, you may have to click more and then go to the Q&A. I'm not sure though.
Okay. So before we go to those questions, we have on this panel a pretty good range of expertise and authority and power. We have a journalist who has spent 25 years working all over the world on border issues. We have an ex-Border Patrol agent, whistleblower, who's been on the ground and who remains intensely involved in these issues. And we have basically an academic who is also on the ground working face to face, hand in hand with mothers and fathers whose families are caught in the gears of this deportation and brutal cruelty machine. On Tuesday, we heard from Verlin Jose of the Tohono O'odham tribe and Isabel Garcia, an activist attorney in the Tucson sector for many, many years. And one question was asked after their discussions. What's going forward right now? Are there people willing to step forward? Are there attorneys willing to work with them to bring accountability, not only in the more general senses, which are important that Todd is talking about, but in the specific cases where murders have occurred, where brutality is a daily occurrence on the border at the hands of Border Patrol. No one is saying that every Border Patrolman is involved in that kind of thing, but it is the culture. And how is that culture ever going to change if some of the folks who have committed these crimes are not brought to justice? That'd be the question. And so we asked the question on Tuesday, and I'll ask it again. Is there a way forward to bring accountability to the Border Patrol? Is there a way, with all of Jen's knowledge that she laid out so convincingly, so thoroughly, to bring that to bear in a court setting to start bringing people to account so that culture is put on notice that they can't operate that way any longer? My question to all three of you is, what do you think about that?
I can tell you that one of the main things that I'm fighting for is getting rid of these secret Border Patrol investigation units, which are blatantly illegal in the United States Border Patrol, because the Border Patrol is not. There's two series, 1801, which is what the Border Patrol is, which allows them small amounts of investigation power in their immigration duties. But then there's the 1811 series, which is more like FBI and Secret Service level, in which they can have these investigative units and can look into, obviously, any crimes, even those outside of immigration or narcotics. So give you a little hint, I wrote an op-ed today that is being edited. It has occurred to me and some other people that before Donald Trump left office, he designated the United States Border Patrol as a security agency. And within the Office of Personnel Management, which is kind of like HR for the government, the agencies who are selected to have this label of security agency are usually intelligence agencies, more like FBI, NSA, even ATF and DEA, and Border Patrol has never fit into that. One of the reasons why the Border Patrol wanted that was because it prevents the press and then victims' attorneys from requesting more FOIAs, because it further hides information about agents, and specifically in this case, what they would be looking at are agents who commit these crimes, knowing more information about them, knowing what's their history. Stuff like that would be relevant for this recent Border Patrol serial rapist who, after 20 years of serving in the Border Patrol, they're now finding out through DNA that when he was first assigned in Arizona, he started his raping career. And so one of the things that would be interested that you would want to know is, where else was he assigned? Was he maybe detailed to the academy in Artesia or one of the academies across the United States? And are there unsolved rapes there? Did he assault female agents? Did he assault female migrants? Any migrants? But because of this security agency designation, they can get away with saying, oh no, you can't ask us that because we're a security agency, so all this is super secret. However, the Border Patrol likes to brag about everything, and I noticed that they're not bragging about being a security agency. It's a big coup for them to be able to get this designation. However, agencies who are security or designated as a security agency are not allowed to have unions. And this has been since the Jimmy Carter administration. And former President George W. Bush even fought with, because some of the agencies in that designation wanted to have unions. And he said, no, if you're going to be at the level of needing extra security because you're saying that the information that you're dealing with is such a high level of national security that we can't just have anybody investigate or request information from you, then you also can't have unions that operate in this way. So my op-ed is suggesting, is flat out demanding that President Biden not let the Border Patrol have their cake and eat it too. And so one of the things that I think is very important is to get rid of this union that is not really a union that benefits the agents in any way as far as hours and benefits and things like that. They are a propaganda outlet. And they get on alt-right media, and they get on in television appearances with Republicans, and they spout propaganda, and they mislead the public, and they denigrate migrants. And I think that is one of the biggest things that I advocate for, is getting rid of the Border Patrol union, which is absolutely out of control right now. And then the other thing too, President Trump, before he signed their new contract with the government, the union as a whole had up to 18,000 hours that they could use for union duty. And he changed it to 154,000 hours per year that they can now do. So that's now why you see them doing all this media stuff in Texas and stuff. So they're not even acting as agents right now. They're not even really agents anymore. They're
And there was a
propagandists.
huge amount of money allocated to the union itself.
Exactly. Yeah. But they legally right now are violating the law by having a union. They're not allowed to have a union if they want to maintain their security agency designation. So I think that's the first step. I mean, I know that a lot of people argue for abolishing Border Patrol, and I'm not exactly sure how we're going to turn the culture within the Border Patrol, but I guarantee you that this government and no government is ready to do that. And so I suggest that we put our heads together in finding other ways to find accountability and change that.
Exactly. Todd, Katie, do you have any comments on this topic about how to bring accountability and how to work together to make that happen?
I mean, I have one little brief thing. I know this is much harder, but like when you think of prevention through deterrence, why can't that be put on trial? I mean, it's a strategy. It's the Border Patrol 1994 memorandum said mortal danger. The idea that it would cause harm to people, if not death, was very much a part of the strategy. It does predictably year after year. But it's not, you don't have a person, right? It's a strategy that knowingly is causing what it causes year after year. And like, it's premeditated murder. We already know that people are going to die. So my question is like, why can't that also be why can't that be put on trial? Why can't they be put in front of a court, like, a person, or is this would this be the Border Patrol itself that goes on trial? I don't know, but it seems to me like to be very specific about something. If you had somebody that was on a shooting rampage and they were going to kill hundreds of people, as will probably happen this summer, and that they're going to do that, that person would be stopped, right? That would be and my question is, and I don't know the answer to this, but is like, why can't this be put into a trial forum or something like that, be brought before a court of law and deliberated like it should be, because it's literally killing people year after year. But that was what I want, the comment that I wanted to bring into it.
Katie?
The only thing I want to add is, in addition to it being hugely important that we bring accountability for everything that's happened for the last almost 100 years of the Border Patrol, that we can immediately start shifting away from having people in detention. I mean, the goal is to have no one in detention, but just with the president's budget, his proposed budget that just came out, it more or less suggests the same funding levels for both CBP and for ICE. And so we're going to be they're proposing having 30,000 beds, 30,000 spots for people to be in ICE custody. And all of everything that's needed for people who are coming across the border is already provided much better and without this violence by community-based organizations. And we heard about some of those that are welcoming people last night. If we were putting instead federal grants towards organizations at the border that could welcome people, provide short-term stay, help them travel to their destination, as well as what we also need is true, the government calls them alternatives to detention right now, but what it really is yet another company profiting off of ankle monitors and more surveillance. But true alternatives to detention. Detention is intended to make sure people show up for court, but in the meantime, people are prevented from really fighting their case well, without access to an attorney, without access to the other materials they need. We need community-based case management organizations that are helping people understand their obligations, getting to court, getting housing and the things they need so they can focus on court. And so if we are able to start shifting towards that, then we'll have less that we need to hold these agencies accountable, because this culture is not going to change.
Yes. And it's part of all of this is just changing the frame too, more generally, from one of viewing immigrants as a security threat to us, and instead realistically and humanely viewing them as the asset that they are in our communities, and the rights that they have as human beings on this planet to seek asylum, to have opportunities for a decent life for themselves and their families, as they are part of our communities. I want to read a question to you from Scott. to all the panelists, can the current conversation about policing in the U.S. interior open doors to similar skepticism about the Border Patrol? Could it fuel immigrant advocate strategies? Or is it naive to hope that the public imagination might be stoked by police Border Patrol comparisons? What extra barriers are there to transparency about the Border Patrol compared to police transparency?
I think the extra barriers would be that migrants can't vote. That's part of, it's difficult to get people who don't live on the border, who don't have family who are affected by the acts that Border Patrol agents do and by the policies that we enact, to want to get into this fight. But I think definitely the similarities, when I was an agent, regular law enforcement, sheriff, police did not look upon Border Patrol agents as brethren. And since 9/11, the Border Patrol has made a pretty good attempt at combining the blue and green lines. And so they do a lot of training with them. They give the agencies, the local agencies down here on the border, a lot of money. That's another problem with accountability, is that a lot of these small towns on the border who have 1 to 3 sheriffs, deputies, their whole budget is relied upon Border Patrol, CBP, detention in their little jails. And so they've created what Border Patrol and CBP has done, and this started with former Border Patrol Chief David Aguilar, who's one of the most corrupt, disgusting chiefs that the Border Patrol ever had, of wanting to become the most, in his words, premier law enforcement agency in the country. And Rodney Scott, the current chief, his biggest contribution to that was that he helped design the intelligence units within the Border Patrol. And so that's why now you see CBP performing surveillance over Black Lives Matter protests and things like that. So what CBP and Border Patrol has done is they have tried to do this with regular law enforcement, and they've been successful in that, especially when you talk about joint task force operations, where normally Border Patrol doesn't have the right to police people, who are protesting civil rights and so forth. But all of a sudden they're in a joint task force with some sheriff's department in the middle of the country where they normally don't have any kind of jurisdiction. But suddenly they just, because they're in this joint task force, they take it up. They take it on.
And they're roving gangs of thugs in the streets of Portland.
Yeah. So what Border Patrol and CBP are constantly trying to do is they are constantly trying to be seen as this special policing unit that's above normal police, but just below like the Marine Corps. They describe themselves as the Marine Corps of the federal law enforcement agency, which is offensive to Marines, frankly. But at the same time, their hiring standards continue to drop, and the lack of accountability keeps being seen. So even when you have, and this is a problem when you're talking about like local investigators who may be charged with investigating like the Anastasio case or the Claudia case or the Jose Antonio case. Well, they know these guys. They know these guys personally. They hang around with these guys. They visit each other. They talk on the phone. They work together. They get money from each other. They party together. This is a problem. And so it is the same fight. It is the same argument. And I think one thing I would like to see, especially when we talk about migrants or asylum seekers, whether they're in custody or in ICE custody, The media and what the Border Patrol and CBP and ICE all want us to say is that they're in detention. But these companies are the same companies that run the private prisons that house Americans. So it's incarceration. Everybody is a prisoner. And that's what we need to be careful and start demanding that people use is, no, it's not detention, because it makes it sound like, you've been put in detention after school kind of thing. Well, they're not. They're incarcerated and they're in jail. And upwards of 60, 70% of them are not criminals. And that's criminal that we're putting people in jail who are not criminals,
And yeah,
regardless of what their
and those
citizenship
of us
status
who
is.
work with the ICE detention facilities like GeoICE and Aurora here in Colorado,
Mhm.
we're constantly made aware that these are prisons, and they're prisons that are worse, not only in terms of the conditions, life-threatening conditions, daily abuse and brutality, the food, whatever you want to look at. These are worse than the federal prisons. They're worse than the state prisons. They're worse than most county jails, the conditions in these. And these folks, Geo and CoreCivic and companies like that are being paid well over $100. I think it's $140 a day to hold these people, and they're spending about $1.50 on food. So, yeah. I have another question for you, and then we're gonna open it up, okay, for more discussion. It's from Brother David. Question for all three. And it just left my screen. How much danger is there now from the ongoing attack against democracy, such as questioning the legitimacy of the 2020 election, the big lie, as we use democratic principles to advocate for more compassion, especially along the US-Mexican border? How much danger is there now from the ongoing attack against democracy? Todd, do you want to take that one? And maybe, maybe you could tie this in with, one of the things that I really took and is in my mind a lot from Border Patrol Nation was your discussion of the commonality of border policy and practice along many first world, third world borders across the world, particularly US-Mexico, Palestine, Israel, but in other places as well. So what do you think the threat is in terms of our democracy writ large, as relates to the issues we're talking about tonight?
Well, that's a complicated question, right? I mean, just I'll give it a shot. I won't try to take up too much space here, but I think of, I mean, you think of the last 4 years before the Biden administration took office, and you had a Trump administration that the border was the big thing, right? The border wall was a campaign promise. The border wall was all he talked about, came and put plaques on it. It's very central to it. And of course, when you think of what happened on January 6th, that's all part of it. To me, it's a part of the same thing in a lot of ways. There's a constituency that's very central to it. And so on one hand, you are like looking at the kind of transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. And when you look at it, like the kind of Democratic Party, especially in the last 4 years, just becoming in a lot of ways, anti-wall, right? You have Joe Biden, who voted for the Secure Fence Act when he was a senator in 2006. But now, I mean, there's a very much an anti-wall, stance, which actually brings us into a very interesting moment, right? Where in this transition, and I want to contextualize it by saying when I did a report where I looked at the campaign contributions going to in the 2020 elections from the border industry and looking at like top border companies and to see and between where they're going to many people, but also the presidential race. And I thought it between Trump and Biden, it would be 50-50, but it was 3-1 to Biden. And that shifted from 2016 when it was favoring the Republicans. And so it goes back to this idea of the industrial complex in a lot of ways that you have companies out there with lots of interests that are going to vote. They can vote, like me or you will vote for one person or the other, but the companies will vote for both, right? And there's that sort of influence that's there. So it leads us into a very interesting moment in this like, well, over the last 100 days of Biden. Is there going to be a shift, you know, like as the campaign promises have, you know, as the executive orders even have talked about, like there's a talk about a reversal of Trump policies, which is basically a reversal of what we see, a lot of the things that we've seen over the last 4 years, but also simultaneously is there going to be continuation of what has been like a long-term bipartisan buildup, which then, you know, it just leads into an interesting moment. What I think for our purposes, I think it's an interesting moment for, and I don't know if I'm answering this question really well, but it leads to an interesting moment as far as activism is concerned, and as far as being able to pressure, and as far as being able to push new things like a lot of the things that Katie was mentioning. Like, is there a way, you know, is what, like you could look at January 6th as a symbol of the 4 years of Trump, and you can look at all the bad things that happened, but then is there a silver lining to that? And is that silver lining, is this a moment, and this could be a critical moment where there's a Democratic president, a Democratic, Senate and Congress, and perhaps this is a moment where many of these, where there could be some momentum. And I don't think that it will be done on its own. There has to be pressure, I think, coming from people like us, I think, coming from people in the Migrant Trail Walk, that pressure the administration to do different things. So that's basically, I mean, people and also like Katie and the American Immigration Council and Jen, with all the kind of work that she's doing, and so many others, those sort of cumulative pressures might be able to, who knows? I don't know. I think this is an opportune moment, but there's a lot of complicated factors at play, and they're often in contradiction to each other.
All right. Katie, by the way, thank you for your compassionate response to that person.
No problem. I think it was
so I said that Brother David's question would be the last one, but I lied. Here's from Gilbert and Gail. We're combining their questions. Is national legislation to require oversight the answer? Is there a way that you and other panelists this week could provide your experience and expertise to the Biden administration as they look at immigration reform?
Well, I mean, there is national oversight. Congress has oversight. There's different committees that are supposed to have oversight, but they keep listening to the same people. They keep allowing the anti-immigrant hate groups to come in and testify as if somehow they're experts on immigration. They allow those groups to dictate policy. They allow those groups to put their leaders. I mean, a lot of the leaders from those groups are still within the various immigration agencies and dictate policy and how that policy looks like on the ground and so forth. So they have all these systems, but the problem is that the systems had a lot of input by, leaders from the Border Patrol and so forth. And they, have figured out how to kind of rig it to their benefit. And frankly, I've sat in congressional members' offices, and they've flat out quietly looked me in the face and told me that the CBP and the Border Patrol are too powerful, and that they're somewhat afraid of coming out against them. So, you know, the national oversight is there. Congress has the ability to do something about it, but they just never do. And I go back to saying, I guess that's because migrants can't vote, you know, and there's not that many people who seem to care about them as much as we do, at least. So until that attitude changes, and maybe we keep advocating, and more people will listen to us, then perhaps. But you know, I mean, the Biden administration is going to listen to, you know, frankly, whoever they choose to listen to. Somebody's mic's on. They choose to listen to.
Connection is going bad on me. Jamie, would you please take over and I'll try to get it back.
Sure. I thought maybe that was just your mic, Tom.
What's that?
I thought maybe your mic was on and that was the issue. But you're losing your connection. Okay, happy to take over. So we were going to kind of, we keep saying we're going to close things down, and then I'm going to throw one more question at our wonderful panelists. And this may just be a review if any of you want to take it. But you know, kind of coming back to all of us as participants on the walk and people that are invested in care and want to make change. What other, you know, what ways would you direct us? I'm looking at Michaela's question. What is the most effective way to advocate for accountability in your experience? If any of you feel like taking that, or kind of an extension of that in terms of us as participants going forward.
I mean, I can start. Katie, do you want to go though? You haven't. I'll just start and then I'll.
You start. Add to it.
Okay. Yeah, like when I think of, you know, when we're talking about this, one of the things I just keep thinking of beyond accountability is like freedom of movement. You know, the freedom of movement of peoples. And I think really, you know, when you look at the Biden administration, said a humane, like a lot of talk about a humane immigration system, right? Knowing what we know and knowing what everyone probably here knows watching this, is like years and years of this kind of border apparatus that is impeding the freedom of movement. And I think that's one aspect of it. And then another aspect of it that I think is really important in terms of accountability is an interrogation of U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. foreign policy element of it is huge, and you can look at, you know, like the North American Free Trade Agreement and the number of small farmers that were displaced, or you know, the opening up of the doors to extractive industry going all through Mexico and Latin America and the Caribbean. And you can look at it in a number of different ways. You know, this sort of these policies that when you look at them, they do affect and impact people, and they cause displacement. But when you talk about border, it's always, if you talk about open borders, for example, it's always for people who are displaced, dispossessed, poor. It's never about what already has open borders, which is really the elite, the rich sectors, corporations, institutions, the U.S. military, even the U.S. Border Patrol, as it travels around the world, it operates in an open border system. And if say a company goes to Guatemala, there's not a border patrol to stop a mining company from contaminating a water supply in Guatemala that might cause somebody to migrate north, right? There's no border patrol stopping, you know, anything that's going in and doing harm. There's no ICE going in and rounding up different extractive industries or trying to stop the greenhouse gas emissions, for example, or the United States has 700 times more than all the Central American countries combined. Yet the United States is building up the wall as people are just displaced left and right due to drought and hurricanes. And so like these sort of interrogation of these sort of policies that cause a displacement to begin with, then you're looking at the border as this kind of answer to a problem that's a lot of miles away. And if you are looking as a U.S. citizen with honesty, with accountability, then you have to kind of look at this foreign policy honestly, and then there's more to it. Then there becomes more to this you're on this other part of the looking at these problems. And I'll leave it at that.
So
people
we're
who
going
are-
shortly. We're going to go to the full panel. I wonder whether Katie, you have any comment. We're talking around the issue of lobbying, consulting with the administration on this, and that's a lot of what the American Immigration Council does, right?
Yeah, I think for people who are trying to get more involved in speaking to their member of Congress and other policymakers, there's a lot of organizations that, including the American Immigration Council, but many others who create like templates and that you can edit or just send to your member of Congress with a few clicks. You can definitely get more involved in that and arrange a meeting with your member of Congress, make phone calls and things like that. But that's a good way to get started, or at least know enough about the issue to be able to speak on it. I'll put in the chat the one we have currently that is to end, as we discussed the other night, and the Title 42 policy that's turning asylum seekers away at the border under a false rationalization of it being for public health reasons. And I think also, as Todd talks about, that this issue can be global, it can also be local. So you can look for both organizations like us that are at a national level, but also there's policies on a local level that have to do with local law enforcement collaborating with ICE that you can advocate for. There's likely a group if you're in a city that is working towards that.
And there are many organizations that all over the country that work with their Congress people and with the federal agencies, what I like to call, having been one, the Burro crazy. So we will continue that work, and we really value the work that all panelists are doing. And we're going to open it up to all of the folks that are online with us.
So first, this is Eric. I just want to thank all of our panelists and for Tom and Jamie helping facilitate. This has been a great night. We are going to invite all of you attendees to become panelists, which means that you will be able to turn your camera on and we can continue to have a conversation tonight. So hopefully you will stay and hang out for that. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.